peace has a sound. Most people don't know that because most people have never actually heard it. Not real peace. Not the kind that settles into the water around you like a warm current and stays. The kind you didn't have to beg for or negotiate or bleed to keep. The kind that just is, because you built it from nothing with your own hands, in a place nobody gave you. Fyren knew that sound now. He heard it every morning when the colony woke up, the slow, layered stirring of hundreds of different lives beginning their days in the same water. The distant hum of the mineral markets at the eastern edge of the settlement. The laughter of the young ones chasing each other through the kelp corridors. The sound of someone singing in the old Somerville dialect 3 caves over, which always made his chest do something complicated. And underneath all of it, steady as a tide, the pulse of the sanctuary itself, warm and alive and permanent in a way his father's cold palace had never managed to feel. He stood at the entrance of their home cave every morning and listened to all of it for exactly as long as he needed to. Some mornings that was a few seconds. Some mornings it was a long time. Today was a long time morning. Behind him, Rhane was still in the inner chamber with Solon. That was their son's name. Solon. Rhane had chosen it, silver copper in the old title language, meaning the thing that is made of 2 lights. Fyren had rolled his eyes at the sentimentality of it, and then spent 3 days quietly deciding it was the most perfect name he'd ever heard. He never told Rhane that. Rhane knew anyway. Rhane always knew. Solon was 8 months old now, which in Mermen years meant he was past the purely luminescent stage and beginning to develop his first proper scales. They came in silver on his left side and copper on his right, exactly the way the Mercury had always promised. His eyes were still deciding what color they wanted to be. Sometimes indigo like Fyren's, sometimes ambergold like Rhane's, sometimes a color that had no name yet, some shifting thing that belonged to neither kingdom and both of them at once. He was the most extraordinary creature Fyren had ever seen. And Fyren had grown up in a palace full of things specifically designed to be extraordinary. The colony had grown up around them quietly, the way settlements do when the people building them aren't trying to build a monument. They were just trying to survive at first, then trying to thrive. Then one day Fyren looked up from the water mapping he'd been doing and realized that what they had built was, by any reasonable definition, a kingdom. Just one that nobody had crowned them to rule. It had started with the others who arrived in the first weeks after the exile. Mermen from both Somerville and Draken, third sons, disgraced warriors, couples whose unions weren't permitted under either crown's law, healers who had spoken against the war and been reassigned to the frontier as punishment. They arrived in 1s and 2s, drawn by the same invisible current that pulls water toward the lowest point. Looking for somewhere. Fyren and Rhane gave them somewhere. The cave system in the Sunlit Isles was larger than it had appeared from the entrance. It went deeper and wider than either of them had mapped in those first desperate weeks, and the more they explored it, the more it felt less like a hiding place and more like a foundation. Warm current channels ran through every major corridor. The mineral veins that lit the walls were self-sustaining, bioluminescent, permanent, requiring nothing. The bedrock was ancient and stable in a way the soft sediment of Somerville's trench floor never was. Rhane, who had always needed to move faster than everything chasing him, found purpose in the building in a way that Fyren hadn't anticipated. He organized the settlement's expansion with a kind of joyful intensity, drawing current flow maps in the sand, arguing cheerfully with the engineers who arrived from Draken, swimming up at dawn to study how the surface light penetrated into their upper caverns and designing structures that used it. He was infuriating. He was brilliant. He barely slept. Fyren organized the governance, the agreements, the treaties with the small independent settlements that dotted the Meridian Shelf, the ones that had watched the Somerville Draken War from a careful distance for a decade and were quietly desperate for a neutral power to exist in the region. He drafted the Charter of the United Trench in the Library Cave, working by mineral light, cross-referencing everything he'd absorbed from Somerville's restricted archives with everything the Drakenborn colonists remembered from their own kingdom's legal tradition. Took 4 months. He rewrote it 3 times. It was, in his private opinion, the best document he had ever produced. Better than anything any royal scribe of either kingdom had written in living memory. He didn't say that out loud. He thought it very loudly in Rhane's direction once, and Rhane had looked at him with those gold eyes and said, "I know, I read it, it's perfect," and then kissed him once, firmly, and gone back to arguing with the engineers. The colony named itself. That was the part that moved Fyren more than anything else they'd built. He and Rhane had been going back and forth about an official designation for the settlement. Rhane wanted something that honored both their original kingdoms. Fyren wanted something entirely new that owed nothing to either. And then one afternoon a Somerville-born healer named Davin, who had arrived in the 3rd month, stood up at the weekly council gathering and said simply, "We already have a name. We call it the Warmth." And every voice in the chamber agreed at once. The Warmth. Not a declaration. Not a monument. Just a description of what it felt like to live there. They kept it. The first sign that something had gone wrong outside came from the east. A scout named Pell, one of the fastest swimmers in the colony, originally from a small independent reef village that had been absorbed into Draken's territory by force 6 years prior, came back from a standard border patrol with a look on his face that Fyren recognized immediately. Not fear. Something quieter. The particular expression of someone who has seen a thing they don't yet have language for. He reported that the Somerville Deep Trench territory was showing signs of pressure collapse. Not natural geological pressure, the kind that happens when the infrastructure of an artificial kingdom starts to fail. When the architecture is old and the engineers who understood it are gone and nobody maintained the weight-bearing current channels because everyone was busy fighting a war. Somerville had been bleeding its structural engineers to the frontier for years. Fyren knew this. He had watched it happen from the inside. His father diverting every skilled resource toward the war effort, treating the kingdom's internal infrastructure as a secondary concern. Something to address after the victory that was always just one more campaign away. There had never been a victory, and now the kingdom was paying for it. 2 weeks later, a second scout reported similar signs from the Draken Warm Current district. Not structural collapse, but ecological. The coral gardens that Draken's economy depended on, the ones Rhane had described so lovingly in the kelp forest all those months ago, were bleaching. The warm current channels that had always fed the reef system were destabilized, disrupted by years of military activity in the shallow passages above. You can't run a war through the same water indefinitely without the water eventually noticing. Rhane went very quiet when he heard this. He sat with it for a while. Then he swam to the upper sanctuary platform where he always went when he needed to think, and he stayed there for most of the evening. Fyren found him there eventually because he always found him eventually. "The gardens," Rhane said, not looking up. "Yes. I used to swim through them before dawn sometimes. Before training. The copper ones especially. They looked like fire in the early light." Fyren settled beside him. Closed the way they always sat. 6 feet had become a habit, a muscle memory. Even now that the tether's urgency had softened into something gentler. "I know," Fyren said. Rhane was quiet again. Then, he should see them. Before they're gone. Fyren looked at him. They might not be gone. With the right intervention. Rhane's jaw was set. "My father won't accept intervention from us." "Your father," Fyren said, "may not have a choice." They came on the same day, which neither of them had arranged, and both of them would later describe as the ocean deciding something on their behalf. Thalassos of Somerville arrived first. Fyren heard the commotion at the settlement's eastern entrance before he saw anything. The border patrol's signal, the murmur that moved through the caverns, the way Davin came to find him with that specifically careful expression that meant something significant had occurred. Fyren followed him to the entrance chamber and stood at its threshold and looked at his father. Thalassos had aged. That was the first thing. In ways that went beyond the months, in ways that spoke of a particular kind of internal wearing down that has nothing to do with time. His ceremonial robes were gone. He wore practical deep-water traveling garments, worn at the edges. His court markings were present but unglossy, the maintenance of them clearly deprioritized. He was not flanked by council members or guards. He had 2 attendants. That was all. He looked at Fyren across the entrance chamber and said nothing for a long moment. Fyren also said nothing. It was Thalassos who spoke first. "I heard what you built. You're standing in it," Fyren said. Thalassos's gaze moved over the entrance chamber. The mineral-lit walls, the clean current flow, the diverse group of colony members who had naturally gathered at a respectful distance to see what was happening. His expression was unreadable in the way Fyren had spent his entire childhood trying to decode. "The trench," Thalassos said. "Section 4 of the eastern wing is collapsing," Fyren said. "I know. I've been tracking it." Something moved across his father's face. Not surprise exactly. More like the particular quality of being seen by someone you tried not to see. The King of Draken arrived 3 hours later, which had the effect of making the encounter considerably more complicated and considerably more necessary at the same time. He came in the same condition, stripped of ceremony, attended by almost no one, wearing the weight of a kingdom that was failing him in direct proportion to how much he had failed it. Rhane was in the council chamber with Solon when his father was announced. He stood up slowly, holding his son against his chest, and walked to the entrance with the kind of measured calm that Fyren recognized as something Rhane had specifically prepared for. Not peace. Readiness. The King of Draken stopped in the entrance of the council chamber and looked at his son. Then he looked at the child in his son's arms. Solon, who had been drowsy a moment before, picked that precise moment to open his eyes. Silver on one side, copper on the other, that impossible shifting color that belonged to neither kingdom and both of them at once. He looked at the large older merman in the entrance with calm, direct attention. Infants don't know what significance is, they just see. The King of Draken made a sound. Low, involuntary, the kind of sound that lives below speech. Rhane said nothing. He just held Solon a little more visibly, a fraction closer, letting his father look at what the exile had produced. "He has your eyes," the King of Draken said finally. His voice was rough. "He has both our eyes," Rhane said. "He has everyone's eyes. He belongs to more than either of us." They called it the Reckoning Days later, the week that followed both kings' arrival. It was not comfortable. Nobody who tries to tell you that confrontation with people who hurt you is comfortable is telling you the truth. It is necessary sometimes, can be worth it, but it moves through you like a cold current, and you feel every inch of it. Thalassos and Fyren spoke alone on the third day. Fyren had requested it, which surprised everyone including himself. They went to the library cave where Fyren had written the charter, and they sat on opposite sides of the mapping table that was covered in diagrams of the United Trenches expansion plans. Thalassos looked at the diagrams for a long time. "You did this in 8 months, he said. "We did this in 8 months, Fyren corrected. "The colony built this. Rhane and I provided the framework. The people provided everything else. You always had your mother's way of organizing things." Fyren absorbed that. His mother had been a structural thinker, quiet and methodical and completely invisible in Thalassos's court, the same way Fyren had been invisible. Hearing her mentioned in this room, in this way, felt like finding an old note tucked inside a book you hadn't opened in years. "She would have liked it here," Fyren said. "Yes," Thalassos said. "Just that. Just yes." There was a long silence. "You built the curse together," Fyren said. "You and the King of Draken jointly designed it, to punish your own sons for trying to end a war you both decided was worth more than we were." Thalassos didn't look away. "Yes. I want to know why." Another silence. Longer this time. "Because if the war ended," Thalassos said slowly, "we had to answer for it. For everything we spent on it. Every life. Every year. Every alliance we broke and every resource we burned." His voice was completely flat, the flatness of someone who has already convicted themselves and is simply reading the verdict aloud. A peace would have required accounting. It was easier to have something to protect against. Fyren looked at his father, at this old, diminished, honest merman sitting in his library, in his kingdom, in the place he had built precisely because his father had thrown him away. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," Fyren said. I know. It doesn't fix it. I know that too. Fyren leaned back, looked at the ceiling. The mineral veins glowed steadily above them, indifferent and permanent. The eastern trench section needs a pressure redistribution system, he said. I have the plans. Davin's engineering team has the capacity to install it in 6 weeks if they start now. Your palace won't collapse. Thalassos was very still. Why would you? Because people live there, Fyren said. People who didn't design the war and didn't build the curse and just need their homes not to fall on them. He looked at his father directly. I'm not saving Somerville for you. I'm saving it for them. Thalassos said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. I understand the difference. Good. Orym arrived on the 5th day. Fyren's brother came alone, which he hadn't expected. No attendants at all. Just Orym, looking older than Fyren remembered, with the kind of quiet in his face that spoke of things processed privately over a long period of time. He brought a document. It was a formal renunciation, Orym's voluntary relinquishment of the Somerville succession, worded in precise legal language that Fyren immediately recognized as drawing from the same archival tradition he'd used for the charter. Which meant Orym had also spent time in those restricted archives. Which meant he had understood, at some point before or after the exile, exactly what had been done. Fyren read the document in full. Then he set it down. You don't have to do this, he said. I was there, Orym said. In the throne room. I stood there and I didn't speak. You were protecting yourself. Yes. No qualification. That doesn't make it right. Fyren looked at his brother. This broader, older, quieter version of himself. And felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was held there. Keep the succession, Fyren said. Somerville needs someone functional on the crown for the transition. After the merge, when the United Trench Charter takes formal precedence, there won't be a Somerville succession to hold anyway. Until then, stay. Orym's jaw worked for a moment. You'd trust me with it. You came here alone, Fyren said. With a renunciation document. You didn't have to do that. You chose to. He picked up the document and handed it back. Yes, I trust you with it. They stayed in the library for a while after that, not talking much, existing in the specific quiet of two people relearning what they are to each other. Rhane and his father had their conversation by the Coral Garden reconstruction site. Rhane had started it the day after his father arrived, recruited 2 of the Draken-born ecological engineers in the colony and began drafting a restoration plan for the bleaching reef system. He did it without announcement, without ceremony, just put the work in front of his father the way he always communicated the things that mattered most to him, through action rather than argument. His father had stood at the site and watched the younger engineers taking measurements and making notations, and Rhane had stood beside him, and eventually his father said, "The Copper Gardens. You remembered the Copper Gardens." "I always remembered the Copper Gardens." His father was quiet for a long time. Then, "I threw a trident at you." "You missed," Rhane said. "I was aiming to miss." Rhane turned to look at him. His father's profile in the low bioluminescent light was the same face he'd been afraid of and desperate to please and furious at and quietly grieving for, simultaneously, for most of his life. It was a complicated face to look at. "I know," Rhane said. "It doesn't." "I know it doesn't fix it," Rhane said. "Fyren and I had that conversation with your counterpart already. Neither of you gets to fix it. You get to do better with what's left. That's all." His father looked at him. Those dark amber eyes. His eyes, the ones Solon had inherited. The ones that had been cold for so long and were now carrying something that looked painfully like recognition. "Show me the restoration plan," his father said. Rhane unrolled it. They spent 4 hours going through it together, his father's engineering knowledge, deep and genuine. Something Rhane had always known existed under the monarchy and never been shown directly, filling in gaps that the colony's ecologists had flagged. It was the longest single conversation Rhane had ever had with his father. It was about Coral. It was about everything. The signing happened on the 14th day. They did it in the warmth's largest gathering cavern, the one with the cathedral ceiling and the mineral vein walls that blazed at full intensity when a crowd gathered and all the body heat in the room fed the bioluminescence. It blazed that day. Fyren had written the document. The Declaration of the United Trench, 3 kingdoms become one. The territories of Somerville and Draken and the warmth merged under a single governing charter, with no crown holding precedence over another, with the colony's council structure forming the model for a joint leadership body, with full protections for every class of person that had been excluded under the old bilateral system. Both kings signed it. Orm signed as Somerville's transitional steward. Rhane signed with his left hand because Solon was in his right, which meant the historical record of the founding document of the United Trench included a small silver-copper smudge at the margin where Solon reached out and touched the page. Fyren noticed this and said nothing and felt something enormous and quiet move through him. When he signed his own name, his hand was completely steady. Afterward, the colony celebrated in the way the colony celebrated everything, without ceremony, with extraordinary warmth, with the kind of communal joy that emerges when people who have survived something difficult together are given permission to be happy. Food came from every corner of the settlement. Music came from 3 different traditions that had never shared a reef before and discovered immediately that they harmonized. The younger children, including the small group that had been born in the warmth and had never known anything else, had absolutely no concept of the magnitude of what had occurred and celebrated it anyway with the pure animal joy of children who understand only that the adults around them are happy. Solon, held by Rhane, watched all of it with those impossible shifting eyes. He would be raised with all of it, with the history, with the weight of the Mercury prophecy and what it had cost, with the knowledge of what his fathers had survived to get here and what they had chosen to build out of the survival. Fyren had already started a record, not a royal archive, not a restricted document, just a plain account, written in the language everyone in the colony spoke, beginning on the day 2 mermen accidentally met in a kelp forest at the border of a war neither of them had chosen. The record was for Solon, and for everyone who came after him. Months passed and settled into years the way they do when life is full enough to stop counting them. The Somerville Eastern Trench was stabilized by the colony's engineering team ahead of schedule. Davin, the healer who had named the settlement, turned out to have a secondary talent for pressure system design that nobody had known about including him, and he became the primary architect of the structural restoration program. He wore it like someone who had finally been handed the right tool for a job they'd been attempting with the wrong one for years. The Draken Coral Gardens came back slowly. Not completely, not in the first year or even the second. Ecological recovery doesn't move fast, which is one of the things it has in common with emotional recovery, but steadily. The Copper Gardens bloomed again first, which Rhane took as either a sign or a coincidence and chose not to decide between them. Both kings remained in the warmth. Not as rulers. As residents, which was an adjustment that required more than either of them would admit and less than either of them feared. Thalassos found a use for himself in the settlement's historical archive, cross-referencing the Somerville records he had brought with the Draken records the colony had accumulated and the independent documents from the Meridian Shelf communities, building a comprehensive history of the region that nobody had ever written from a neutral position before. He was meticulous and thorough and completely absorbed in it. He and Fyren sometimes worked in adjacent sections of the library cave without speaking, which was more intimacy than they had managed in Fyren's entire childhood, and which was enough. The King of Draken taught the young engineers. He was a genuinely gifted teacher, impatient and demanding and structurally brilliant, and the cohort of young mermen who trained under him produced work that improved every major system in the settlement within 3 years. Rhane watched his father teach sometimes from the corridor outside the training chamber, not entering, just watching. Sometimes his father glanced up and saw him. Sometimes they nodded at each other across the space. It wasn't everything, but it was real and it was theirs and it grew. Solon grew fastest of all. He had Rhane's restlessness and Fyren's precision and some third quality that belonged entirely to himself. A kind of open attention to the world, a radical willingness to be curious about everything, that the colony's older members sometimes described as the most purely hopeful thing they had ever been near. He learned both Old Kingdom languages before he was 2. He learned the Tradewater dialect at 3. He was swimming faster than most adults at 4, which surprised no one, and had decided by 5 that he wanted to learn ecology from the Draken engineers and governance from Fyren and music from the woman 3 caves over who sang in the old Somerville dialect every morning. He was, by any measure, impossible. He was, by any measure, entirely real. Fyren watched him one evening from the entrance of their home cave, the same spot he stood every morning to listen to the colony waking up. Solon was in the kelp corridor below, chasing 2 other children through the glowing fronds, his silver and copper scales catching the mineral light, his laughter carrying up through the warm water. Rhane came to stand beside him. His arm found Fyren's shoulder, easy and certain, the way it always did. "He's going to redesign the whole settlement by the time he's 12, Rhane said. "I can already tell." "He's going to redesign the whole region by the time he's 20, Fyren said. Rhane was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed his forehead to Fyren's temple. That gesture, that particular one, the same one from the cold night water 60 leagues from anything safe. The one that meant I am here and you are here and that is enough. "We did good," Rhane said. Fyren looked at the colony below, at the warm mineral light, at the sound of hundreds of lives built on a foundation of 2 people who had refused to stop. "We did good," he agreed. The water was warm. The light held steady. And far below in the kelp corridors, Solon's laughter rose like the first note of a song that was only just beginning.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.